everybody. It's mo.news here. It's Wednesday, August 7th. You're listening to the Mo.news podcast.
Hi, Mosh. Hi, everyone. I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. And yesterday, Jill, after a year and a half campaign, we actually now know everyone on the presidential and VP ticket after what has been a very tumultuous 6 weeks.
That's right. So let's get straight to the headlines here. She has her Veep. Not a surprise. Kamala Harris picked a governor from the Midwest, but not the one that some senior Democratic leaders thought she was going to go with. We'll tell you all about Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. And Moshe, I do believe that you owe me a dinner.
Yes, Jill. Pick your spot, but nothing excessive, please.
And in case you missed Monday's podcast, my prediction was Tim Walz. Moshe was predicting Josh Shapiro, and we said whoever loses has to buy the other one dinner.
So there you go, Jill. Even we'll cover dessert too.
Plus, how Republicans are reacting to her pick for running mate. Overseas, Hamas has named Yahya Sinwar, who was the architect of the October 7th attack, as its new leader. And the Justice Department has charged a Pakistani man in an alleged plot to kill U.S. leaders in America.
Yeah, this is quite a story, Jill. We'll break it down for you.
Yesterday, we told you about a stock market sell-off. Well, what happened on Wall Street on Tuesday? Former New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg giving a huge gift to 4 Black medical schools endowments. And an American teenager just set a world record in a new Olympic sport. We'll tell you about it. Plus, Moshe is on this day in history.
Woo-hoo. Nobody knows it. Is your clue today?
I think I do. I think I know.
One of the best duets in history, Jill.
Okay, let's start with our top story. Vice President Kamala Harris, who has now officially secured the support of enough Democratic delegates to become her party's nominee, has picked her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. And so far, Democrats are quickly embracing their new ticket. The two appeared together for the first time at a campaign event in Philadelphia on Tuesday night as they embark on a 7 swing state blitz this week. Harris and Walz walked on stage to a thunderous crowd.
Tim is more than a governor. To the people of southern Minnesota, for 12 years, he was congressman. And to his former high school football players, he was coach. And in 91 days, the nation will know Coach Walz by another name, Vice President of the United States.
So, Moshe, clearly a lot of excitement there in Philadelphia. But the big question, who is Tim Walz? Outside of Minnesota, most Americans, 70%, according to a new NPR survey, say they've never heard of him or just don't have an opinion. So here is a quick bio. Walz is 60 years old. That's only about 6 months older than Kamala Harris, even though the internet thinks he looks a lot older.
Yeah, Jill, we had some fun with that. We note that actually Brad Pitt is a few months older than Tim Walz. Shows you the difference, though, between going into, as Walz says, teaching versus Hollywood.
So Walz is originally from rural Nebraska. He is a U.S. Army National Guard veteran and a former high school teacher. He taught geography. He also is a football coach. His wife, Gwen, is also a teacher. They met while teaching. The couple has 2 kids, Hope and Gus, that they had with the help of IVF. Walz first ran for office in 2006 in a Republican-leaning congressional district where he upset the incumbent. He kept the seat until he won the Minnesota governorship in 2018 and then won it again in 2022. Apparently, he caught Harris's eye in some of his attacks on the Trump-Vance ticket. Here is a clip of Walz appearing on MSNBC's Morning Joe last month. He has already gone viral for characterizing the Trump-Vance ticket as weird.
Well, it's true. These guys are just weird. And it's, you know, they're running for He-Man Women Haters Club or something. That's what they go at. That's not what people are interested in. And there is angst because robber barons like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump gutted the Midwest, told us we didn't do that. They talk about private schools. Where in the heck are you going to find a private school in a town of 400? Those are public schools. Those are great teachers that are out there making a difference and gave us an opportunity to succeed. That angst that J.D. Vance talks about in Hillbilly Elegy, none of my hillbilly cousins went to Yale.
Jill, it's just the folks, direct, very short sound bites making your point. That was apparently one of the more important things here for the Harris team.
So he brings some Midwest credibility, and they hope that he can help them connect with working class voters, especially in nearby competitive Midwest states. Moshe, a lot of reporting on why Harris picked Walz over some of the other names that were on the short list. We're talking about Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro and Arizona Senator Mark Kelly. Politically, both of those men are a bit more moderate, whereas Walz is seen as more liberal and progressive, especially in recent years. But ultimately, this may have just come down, but some are describing as a vibe check.
Yeah, that's what the people around Harris are saying, is that she met with all these folks and she was looking for chemistry, and she had more chemistry with Walz than some of the other names here. At the same time, part of this was also about the negatives around the other guys. You know, ultimately, you're making a decision here. And as Joe Biden has said, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. So she was weighing her options, very truncated timeline here. Typically, you take several months to figure this out. She had 2 weeks, given what's taken place in the Democratic Party. With the Shapiro, Kelly picks, you noted they were moderate. They did bring the positive of each bringing a potential swing state help to her in Kelly's case, Arizona, in Shapiro's case, Pennsylvania. This election might completely come down to Pennsylvania. Another issue with Shapiro, who apparently was the other finalist here, according to people around her, the feeling among some is that he could try to outshine her, that he was very ambitious. This is something that his longtime competitor in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman, who's now the senator from Pennsylvania, they've had it out for one another for a long time. He was making the argument internally, don't pick Shapiro. He wants to be the number one here. And so that was apparently part of the issue here, as she decided between Walz and Shapiro. Among other things, we should keep in mind, she's been vice president. She is vice president. She's been doing that for 3.5 years. So she has some unique insight into the job, the experience, what she wants out of that job. And so as she met with her finalists here, she had the chemistry tests. There's reporting from her people that she just instantly connected with Walz, that she liked what he brings, his folksy nature, the ability to make these arguments succinctly, the weird thing that he made go viral. She's from deep blue California. She's half black, half Indian. He's from Nebraska. He was in the National Guard. He owns guns. He hunts. You know, two different worlds. And Harris will have difficulty connecting with those types of voters. And so the feeling is Walz can help there. She's also probably here more comfortable with him politically. They stand in the same places. He's had his kids with IVF. He ensured that abortion is legal in Minnesota. So they've worked together on those issues. And you had the anti-Shapiro campaign by some progressives, including on issues like Israel. As we discussed yesterday, some saw it at points as anti-Semitic. At the end of the day, though, Walz had a lot of people supporting him, including a lot of his former House colleagues, Nancy Pelosi, who he served in Congress with. And so a lot of them were getting in Harris's ear, being like, put one of our own. He's going to help you a lot. Because one thing we've been talking about a lot, Jill, is politics. But part of what you have to do once you get elected is to govern. And similar to Obama, who didn't have much experience at Capitol Hill, he brought in Joe Biden as his VP, senator who spent 30 years there. The feeling here is Harris spent a very brief time on Capitol Hill. So if she's elected and needs to govern, Tim Walz, who spent more than a decade on Capitol Hill, could help her with that. I do, though, as we talked about this competition, want to play a bit of Josh Shapiro yesterday. He introduced them at this rally in Philadelphia after having been rejected earlier in the day. He had to introduce the prom queen. Here's how he did it.
I'm going to be working my tail off to make sure we make Kamala Harris and Tim Walz the next leaders of the United States of America.
It's notable, Jill, because the Trump folks apparently were worried about Shapiro, that if she picked Shapiro, that would take Pennsylvania off the map for him. And so there was joy on the left, joy on the right, and then in the middle yesterday among the mo.news community, questions about who he is and what this all means.
Most Republicans are already pouncing. They're describing the Harris-Walz ticket as a dream for the radical left. Republican vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance slamming Walz as a San Francisco-style liberal. I want to play a bit of an attack ad already put together to take on Walz, targeting a bill that he had signed into law that put menstrual products in girls' and boys' bathrooms at public schools.
What could be weirder than signing a bill into law that requires schools to stock tampons in boys' bathrooms? Or weirder than signing legislation allowing minors to receive sex change operations? Try electing the man who signed those bills, Vice President of the United States. Enter Chief Weirdo Tim Walz.
So you see them trying to spin that weirdo.
I'm not weird. You're weird. These are our politics.
You should expect to also hear Republicans attack Walz for being too slow to respond to violent protests in 2020 in Minneapolis after a police officer killed George Floyd. As governor, Walz did deploy hundreds of National Guard troops 3 days after Floyd's death, but critics have argued that it was just too slow of a response.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second. This will come up a lot. Jill, I've tried to put together a 90-second rundown of what took place over on our Instagram account. So you can check that out over on the mo.news Instagram account. Effectively, this is what took place. Let's go back to May 25th, 2020. Governor Walz is 1 year into his term as governor. And you have the police killing that night of May 25th of George Floyd. The protests begin the next day on May 26th. They start to become violent about 24 hours later. Now we're 48 hours in, May 27th. Police cars are being burned, looting is happening. The mayor of Minneapolis, his name is Jacob Frey, puts in a request to the governor, Walz, to deploy the National Guard. And this is where there's a dispute. There's been investigations. Why did Walz take 24 hours to deploy the National Guard after the request? Now, the governor says the city was a mess. I was looking for details on where they wanted the Guard. Keep in mind, the National Guard's not like the U.S. Army. If you're a National Guardsman, you have a regular job. You're a fireman. You're a police officer. You're a teacher. But then you get called up. So it takes a while to deploy you. So Walz eventually approves the request 24 hours later on the 28th. It's that night, and the National Guard's still not there, when there's that infamous scene where the police have to give up a police building to the rioters, and they light the police building on fire. Many of us remember those images. And so there have been a lot of hearings and investigations at the state level there as to what took place. Again, Walz says, I didn't get detail from the city. We tried our best. I did deploy the Guard to St. Paul. Minneapolis was unclear as to where he wanted it. The mayor says, no, you dawdled. State Republicans say, no, you dawdled. So there's a lot of questions here on the 24-hour time frame. Keep in mind, at the White House at that time, who was president? Donald Trump. He's meeting with the defense secretary. The defense secretary is calling the governor. They're talking about how to deploy that. So there's a lot of finger pointing back and forth here. The bottom line is this will certainly come up a lot. And what we're really talking about here is a 24 to 36 hour time frame as to what took Walz, and I mentioned he will get this question. We'll see how he answers it today and in the coming days as to what the delay was there. As far as other issues, just looking back here, the transitions I find really interesting, both for Harris and Walz. Harris starts out very progressive, and she's gradually made her way to the middle, especially as Biden's VP. And as she runs now, she's rejecting some of the positions she took in 2020 when she ran to the left. At the same time, you have Walz, who has gradually made his way to the left from the center. So Harris has gone from left to center. Walz has gone from center to left. You mentioned, Jill, that he won in a Republican district, beat a competitive seat there. He voted to the right of most House Republicans. He was a centrist. He was on the Veterans Committee. He worked on agriculture issues. He had an A rating from the NRA. He's a hunter, a gun owner, and then the Parkland school shooting happens. And that's when he rejects the NRA and says, we got to have some limits on guns here. And so then he becomes governor the following year, and you start to see more progressive legislation from Walz. But they believe that his working class background, his rural background, will help them speak to that part of the country. And, he has been vocal on that in recent interviews. So it'll be very interesting as we hear more. And one notable thing I'll add here, Jill, you heard the argument yesterday from J.D. Vance and the Republicans. Hey, what does Harris stand for? She's been the nominee now for more than 2 weeks. and we haven't heard her do a single interview. So there will be this drumbeat. They're trying to actually galvanize the media to say, hey, media, why aren't you wondering why Harris hasn't done an interview yet? And so you're going to see that pressure rise in the coming days and weeks, especially since there are a lot of issues. We still don't quite know where now Harris, the presidential nominee, stands, because she's had to be deferential to Biden the last few years.
And especially considering it's such a truncated election season for her. I mean, it's 3 months. That's it.
Yeah, you usually have time to do policy papers. I mean, just to give you an extent of presidential campaigns, you will bring in like lead advisors on all the key issues. You're my healthcare advisor. You're my education advisor. And you'll work up policy papers and you'll say, okay, where do I stand on this? What are the solutions? Well, she's been vice president, so she has staffing there. At the same time, I don't know what's been happening behind the scenes or how much she really thought this scenario might unfold, but now she's like suddenly at the top of the ticket. And so has she thought this through? Are they doing polling on these issues? I imagine, she has a sense of these issues, but where is she going to stand? What's her policy agenda? She's speaking in very broad strokes. She's relying on her bio, even at that rally introducing Walz last night. She's going back to the things she's been doing for a couple of weeks. I was a prosecutor. I dealt with criminals and, people who abused women. So I know Donald Trump's type. So she keeps, that's been the thing we've been playing on this podcast. But a forward-looking agenda for what she's really working on and what's the uniquely Harris administration. We're going to wait to hear about that.
And Moshe, the best part of the Mo News community is that we've got people everywhere. And I know that you asked particularly people who live in Minnesota what they thought about Governor Walz. So what did you learn? What did they say?
Oh, don't you know? We have a lot of people in Minnesota who follow us on the Mo News. That was a terrible accent. I apologize to all of you. I hope you'll continue listening to this podcast. From Chicago, we're sort of nearby Minnesota. You guys put ketchup on your fries. You guys put ketchup on your hot dogs. We put mustard. Anyway, so Walz fans, and I would say the majority of the Mo News community from Minnesota were Walz fans. Not surprising, is about a 60% approval rating in the state. Here are the comments. He made school breakfast and lunch free for all kids. True. Not a Minnesota guy, but a Wisconsin guy, and I've been jealous of what's been happening in Minnesota. Somebody writes, he's ridiculously down-to-earth, classic Midwestern dad, bipartisan, veteran, down-to-earth, real deal, school lunch bill, teacher here, free lunch bill. That was a big deal to a number of people in Minnesota. People also appreciated his response to COVID there. Those are the people in the cities. So that's Duluth, Rochester, Minneapolis, St. Paul. Then we have rural Mo News team members from Minnesota who write very liberal, had a surplus, still tried to raise taxes, disliked outside the city, handled the George Floyd riots horribly. We talked about that recently, but that's a big shtick for people who are in the more red area. There's a piece of legislation he signed allowing people who are in the country illegally to have driver's licenses. That's an issue we can get into at some point. And then, of course, COVID is cited by people on the right because they didn't like the restrictions that he approved of during COVID. So that's the split, not surprising. And some of the arguments you're hearing from critics in Minnesota are the same criticisms you're hearing from the Republicans, which, again, notably, they called him like a wannabe Californian, well, a liberal. They're trying to basically paint Harris and Walz the same way. But as we've talked about on this podcast before, Jill, it ultimately comes down to the top of the ticket. Walz will be out there. This is probably the most we'll be talking about the Walz in the same way the most we're talking about J.D. Vance was the day he was announced. And typically over the next 90 days, 90 to 95% of the conversation will be about the top of the ticket unless one of them screws up, Vance or Walz. That's typically when you hear about the VP, when they make some sort of gaffe, they say something out there. That's typically when they come up. So if he's doing his job as VP, he's going to be out there doing small rallies, small get-togethers in key areas. They're looking at the demographics. They're looking where they have to churn out the vote. They're looking at areas where he might be popular, and they're going to send him there.
Okay, time now for the speed read from Axios. Hamas has officially named Yahya Sinwar, who's their top official in Gaza and also the mastermind of the October 7th attack on Israel, to be its top political official globally. That comes after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, allegedly by Israel last week in Tehran. Now, until now, Sinwar has been focused on Gaza, and he is currently hiding in tunnels under Gaza, coordinating the war that Hamas launched on October 7th. So this new promotion anchors Sinwar's status as the top and perhaps even sole decision maker in Hamas, both inside of the Palestinian territories and in the diaspora. A Hamas official told Al Jazeera that Sinwar was selected by consensus and said that his elevation is a reflection of Hamas's understanding of the challenges in the current phase of negotiations for a Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal. He said Hamas's negotiation team, which was led by Haniya's deputy, isn't going to change, and added that Sinwar has always been part of the negotiations. President Biden spoke today with leaders of Egypt and Qatar, the two key mediators between Israel and Hamas, and told them that it is urgent to bring the process to closure as soon as possible, according to the White House.
So Sinwar is Hamas's only remaining senior figure right now after Israel has assassinated the group's top military commander, his number two, Mohammed Dept, the political leader, Ismail Haniya's deputy, Salah Aruri, all have been assassinated in the past couple of months here. By the way, Sinwar is alive, not for lack of trying by Israel. He's the most wanted man in Israel. They have vowed to kill Sinwar. In fact, the response from the Israelis to the Sinwar promotion yesterday was, there's only one place for that man. It's next to Mohammed Dept, who's dead, and all the terrorists who are responsible for October 7th. This is the only place we are preparing and designating for him. That was the Israeli response to the promotion for Sinwar. We've told you about Sinwar before. He spent years in an Israeli prison back in the day. In fact, an Israeli doctor was approved to give him surgery to remove a brain tumor back in the day that saved his life. Sinwar was then exchanged. He was part of a Israeli hostage for a prisoner exchange more than a decade ago that returned him to Gaza. He moved up through the ranks. He has a messianic viewpoint. He sees himself in a historical context as the person who will completely destroy Israel, boot the Jews from the Middle East, replace Israel with a Islamic Palestine. Notably, Sinwar's brother continues to get promoted in the process here. He appears to still be alive, also living in the tunnels below Gaza right now. October 7th surprised a lot of Israelis. Sinwar had been sort of playing both sides for a while, playing a moderate-ish, negotiating with the Israeli government to get more jobs for Palestinians in Gaza, in Israel, leading some Israelis, including the prime minister, it appears, to think, oh, Sinwar is someone we can deal with. He wants to be a governing guy. Well, all the while he was planning October 7th. So he's the architect of that. That kills more than 1,200 Israelis, takes more than 250 hostages. And here we are, 10 months later. Sinwar is now the leader of all of Hamas. And so we'll see what comes of all of that. And Jill, it comes as we continue to watch the Iranian response to Israel for that assassination of Haniya, the previous political leader of Hamas. It could come in hours. It could come in days. It could come in weeks. That's part of the psychological strategy of Iran. Keep Israel wondering when, how big, and where they might attack.
From the New York Times, we're learning that a Pakistani man with ties to the Iranian government allegedly came to the United States in recent months to recruit people to carry out a political assassination here on U.S. soil. Investigators believe that his target list likely included former President Trump. This is according to a senior law enforcement official. At the same time, while the case that was investigated weeks before a gunman tried to kill former President Trump at a Pennsylvania campaign rally, they actually do not believe that there is any connection to the attempt on Trump on July 13th. So yes, there were at least two plots against Trump here. The man is 46-year-old Asif Raza Merchant. He arrived in the United States in April. He was eventually arrested in New York on July 12th. The day before, a 20-year-old man, Matthew Crooks, shot and slightly wounded Trump during that rally in Pennsylvania. Again, officials say there is no evidence that indicates that this plot was connected in any way to the actual shooting in Pennsylvania. But they say that the arrest of Merchant allowed them to disrupt what they characterized as a far-ranging plot that also included stealing computer files from U.S. officials and staging protests against American treatment of Muslim countries. U.S. intelligence agencies were tracking this potential Iranian assassination plot against Trump in the weeks before the assassination attempt that prompted the Secret Service to enhance security for the former president before that outdoor campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania.
So there's a lot going on here. Let's backtrack. There's this guy. He's Pakistani. He goes to Iran, apparently gets some marching orders, comes to the U.S. to work on getting assassinations going, and he needs some hitmen. Separately, you got the 20-year-old in Pennsylvania, and they say these are separate right now, who comes up with his own plot to shoot the president. And then you have that crazy coincidence that Merchant is arrested the day before the shooting takes place in Pennsylvania. Again, we're told these are two completely different situations, though, again, the timing is pretty wild here. So Merchant flew from Pakistan to Iran, gets his marching orders, comes to the U.S., and is trying to recruit some hitmen. So this starts in April. He arrives. And one of the people he ends up reaching out to, being like, you want to be one of my hitmen to go kill some people, is a confidential source who reports it to law enforcement. So now law enforcement is hooked into this, and they are playing rope-a-dope here. Get some stuff out of this guy, figure out what he's up to. Merchant apparently explains as he gets into June, this is not a one-time opportunity. He needs multiple men who can do the killing. He needs 25 people who can perform a protest, a distraction after the murder occurs. He wants a woman to do reconnaissance. Merchant has a whole plot here that he's worked up. By mid-June, he meets up with the people he thought would carry out the hits. They turned out to all be undercover law enforcement agents. Merchant agrees to pay them. He's like, hey, I want to offer you some money. Here's $5,000 as an advance, $5,000. Here's an advance on the assassination, and I'm going to make plans to get you out of the country after you do the killings that I want you to. This progresses to the point where they're worried enough about him and what's going on, where on July 12th, this merchant's about to leave the country, they arrest him. So that's where we're at. It comes, as we've told you before, Iran has been looking revenge on Trump and people around him since 2020. That's when the Trump administration approved the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. He was the high-ranking Iranian general who the U.S. assassinated 4 years ago. Iran's been looking for revenge since then. They had plots on John Bolton, who was the national security advisor to Trump. He's gotten extra security. They had plots on Mike Pompeo, the former CIA director under Trump. He's gotten extra security. They've learned about these plots on Trump. He got extra security. And all the while, you had the 20-year-old in Pennsylvania who was working up his thing. So we will wait to hear more on all of that. But that's what we know, Jill. It's pretty remarkable to kind of follow all these headlines. And given everything that's going on, the fact that this is probably didn't get that much attention yesterday in the news. I was like, by the way, they arrested this Pakistani guy for a plot on Trump amid all the other things we're watching.
I think it's also fascinating how Iran plays the long game, which was something that was talked about when Trump first ordered the killing of Soleimani, which was, we may not know what Iran's response is for years. Yeah. And then all of a sudden it would be, oh, okay, that's what it was. And it comes as Israel is prepping or preparing for some sort of retaliation from Iran, which they're saying could happen in days, in weeks, or who even knows. So it is just fascinating how this stuff actually works.
Yeah, very long memories in the Middle East. You could even say, Iran, this is something bin Laden even talked about back in the day, that the Americans, they think about years, maybe decades, but these guys are thinking about centuries, thinking about millennia. Sinwar, the guy we mentioned in the last story who runs Hamas now, he sees himself as a modern-day Saladin being the Muslim leader who pushed back against the Crusades 1,000 years ago. So this is the long perspective that they have, and we're just talking about 4 years here. But the point is that ultimately they know that the West has short memories, and they're like, we're going to get you at some point for the things that you did to us. And that's apparently part of this. They probably should have found a better guy. His literal first attempt to find a hitman in New York, he stumbled upon a law enforcement person.
Whoops.
But this also goes to show law enforcement has to be on these things 100% of the time. They miss a thing like they did in Butler, Pennsylvania, and you could have a tragedy. And that's what I try to explain to people all the time. They're like, oh, I can't believe this happened. I was like, the job of the FBI, the Secret Service, all these organizations, they have to be right 100% of the time. And by the way, if they track someone who they shouldn't have been tracking, then they get accused of overreach. So they have to be on the right people. They have to get them in time. They have to sort of play the rope-a-dope to who are they working for? What's their actual plot? You can't arrest them right away because you got to gather evidence, but then you're leaving them out there to potentially do nefarious things. So anyway, we can talk about this on future podcasts, but a fascinating development.
Switching gears to business news from the Wall Street Journal, an update on the stock market, which had a better Tuesday. Markets steadied after Japan's Nikkei clawed back a chunk of its brutal losses from Monday's mayhem. The S&P 500 also gained about 1% a day after the economic angst and the unraveling of some crowded trades drove the S&P to its biggest drop since 2022. Some of Monday's biggest losers were Nvidia and Robinhood markets. Those also rose, although not enough to send them into positive territory for the week.
So a day after it felt like the world was ending, the market's like, okay, we've done our thing. We're back up. The market had its freak out. And then the deal with the investors was like, all right, nothing is as bad as we thought it was yesterday. There's a volatility index, what they call the VIX. If you've ever watched CNBC or Bloomberg, it's effectively Wall Street's fear gauge that had rocketed to 60 points, which is a big deal on the VIX. That then fell to 26 on Tuesday. One investment strategist telling CNBC, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some more pressure in the coming weeks, but I do think the growth scare was overdone. The labor market still healthy, despite that unemployment rate slightly rising. Volatility could continue, but I think people have realized the underlying fundamentals of the economy still strong. And so there you have it. And that's what we were telling you on the podcast, especially if you have some investments. Don't freak out over small moves. You want to be making your investments with a long-term horizon.
From the Associated Press, Michael Bloomberg's organization, Bloomberg Philanthropies, committed $600 million to the endowments of 4 historically Black medical schools to help secure their future economic stability. Speaking in New York at the annual convention of the National Medical Association, an organization that advocates for African-American physicians, Bloomberg, who is a former New York City mayor and billionaire founder of Bloomberg LP, he pointed to the closure in the last century of all but 4 historically Black medical schools, despite the documented impact that Black doctors have on improving health outcomes for Black patients. So he said the lack of funding and support, driven probably in no small part by prejudice and racism, have forced many to close their doors, and we cannot allow that to happen again. This gift will help ensure that it doesn't. Black Americans fare worse in measures of health compared to white Americans, according to an AP report. Experts believe increasing the representation among doctors is one solution that could disrupt these inequities. In 2022, only 6% of U.S. physicians were Black, even though Black Americans represent 13% of the population.
So as of today, Mike Bloomberg is still the 13th richest man in the world. He's worth $104 billion. So just to give you context, there are 12 people richer than Mike Bloomberg, who is worth $104 billion. And he's been giving a lot lately. These gifts are among the largest private donations to historically Black colleges and universities. $175 million to the Howard University College of Medicine. Charles Drew University gets $75 million. Xavier University of Louisiana also gets a grant here. This comes, as we told you earlier this summer, of his $1 billion pledge to Johns Hopkins University. That'll mean that most medical students there will never have to pay tuition. And back in 2020, Bloomberg granted those same medical schools I just mentioned $100 million that went to reducing the debt load of enrolled students. So Bloomberg's focus of late, the future of medicine.
And finally, from CNN, as of Tuesday, an 18-year-old from Texas can lay claim to being the fastest ever Olympian, at least when it comes to traveling vertically. Sam Watson set a speed climbing world record of 4.75 seconds in the Parisian suburbs, where a temporary climbing wall has been installed for the Olympics. He said, I suppose 4.75, the fastest time ever run in the Olympics in a time sport, is a cool title. No one can take that away, I suppose. Yes, 18-year-olds, it is a cool title. No, but seriously, this is actually a huge accomplishment. If you've ever seen one of these events, any kind of distraction can prove costly. Athletes scale a 15-meter wall in about 5 seconds, scampering up a series of holds towards a red buzzer at the top of the route. Lightning reactions and fast twitch muscle fibers are a necessity in the event, while the slip of a foot or even a momentary lapse of concentration can result in an athlete's elimination from the competition. Watson did set the previous speed climbing world record of 4.79 seconds at a World Cup event in China earlier this year.
So if this sport doesn't sound familiar to you, it's because it's pretty new. Sport climbing made its debut back in Tokyo 3 years ago. Controversially, it combined 3 disciplines, speed, bouldering, and lead, if you know this sport, into a one-medal event. That was considered to be too much, so they changed the format for Paris. And so the speed finals will take place on Thursday for the men, and the women go today. All right, we can begin in 1782. On this day in 1782, George Washington, then a general, not yet president, creates the badge for military merit. It becomes known as the Purple Heart. Fast forward to 1942, staying with military history here. The Allies make their first major offensive in the Pacific Theater against the Japanese. This is just a few months now after Pearl Harbor. It's the Battle of Guadalcanal. The battle would last 6 months. A little space history. On this day in 1959, the U.S. launches Explorer 6, which sends back a picture of Earth to Earth. We take for granted now all these beautiful pictures we have of Earth from space. That was a new thing on this day about 65 years ago. On this day in 1974, you might have seen these photos before. Philippe Petit, he's a Frenchman, performs a high wire act between the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, just after those buildings had opened. As we mentioned at the top of the podcast, on this day, 48 years ago, Elton John and Kiki D reached #1 with Don't Go Breaking My Heart.
Ooh.
Nobody knows it.
I would think this is one of the top duet karaoke songs out there.
Oh, it's got to be that. And what's the song with Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton? Islands in the Stream.
Oh yeah. Come away with me. Who remade that? We can rely on each other. Is it Ghetto Superstar?
Ghetto Super.
Superstar. Yeah, well,
they sampled.
What you are.
I love that you're like, did was that more recent? That was from the 90s. That was from 30 years ago.
Like yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. So they sampled that. So there you have it.
I knew it was resonating for me.
Because it came from the late 90s, and I remember that.
All right, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, tell your friends about us. We really would appreciate it. It helps us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And write us a review in the App Store.
Yeah, I have an idea for the review. So some of you who wrote those messages to us yesterday, where you almost dropped something. Someone said they almost dropped a weight on their foot, Jill, as they listened to RFK and the Bear yesterday. They were working out while listening to the podcast, and they're like, I was cracking up. I almost injured myself. So if you enjoy anything, take a moment to leave a review over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify especially. And we're glad you enjoyed that. Frankly, Jill, there's a part of me today that just wanted to talk about the Bear and RFK more. We didn't even get into the fact that he had a broken bicycle from a friend who asked their friend to dispose of a bike from. Anyway, we didn't even get into all the stuff that I wanted to get into with that story because it's just so absurd. He had a broken bike, then he had luggage for the trip, and he's got a dead bear in there. And then it's not lost on me if you go to Peter Luger's in Brooklyn that you have valet. Does that mean the valet was parked in the car with the dead bear, the broken bicycle, the luggage for his trip, all in the back?
My God.
I have so many questions.
Right, imagine the valet accidentally opened the trunk. What is happening?
An animal in the back. Yeah.
All right, worth its own podcast one of these days, I think.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good.
Bye, everyone.